There are a lot of different card designs in Magic's history, and many of those cards have been iterated upon over and over again. One of those designs are cards that care about other copies of themselves. There have been a surprisingly large number of cards with this gimmick, and despite how inherently limiting it is, many of these cards have been incredibly powerful. So today we're going to go over the best cards ever printed with this gimmick, and explain what allows them to be so strong. And starting us off at number 10, we have Dragon's Approach. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 and 1 red. It is the ability where you can have any number of cards in your deck named Dragon's Approach. It has the effect where it deals 3 damage to each opponent. Then you can exile it and 4 cards named Dragon's Approach from your graveyard, and if you do, search your library for a dragon creature card and put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. Now, on its own, Approach is just a 3-mana lava spike, which is a pretty awful rate considering the card does this for 1 mana. Of course, if you're playing Approach, the damage isn't the main thing on your mind. The real reason to play Approach is to try and tutor out any dragon in the game for only 3 mana. Now, it would take a lot of mana to get 4 approaches into the graveyard normally, but there are ways to speed this up. Cards like Faithless Looting, Tormenting Voice, and Wheel of Fortune can all be used to discard copies in your hand and get them into the graveyard for slightly cheaper. Not to mention, thanks to being able to play any number of approaches in your deck, you can easily stuff the deck full of more than enough of them so that you'll constantly be drawn into more of them. You can also use cards like Ruby Medallion to reduce the cost of your red spells and cast Approach more easily. This will let you do a lot of damage fast, but nowhere near as fast as with other burn spells. And this isn't quite enough to close games in most competitive formats. However, in Commander, the ability to deal damage to all of your opponents is extremely valuable. Not to mention just how good being able to find any dragon you want out of your deck is. There are a ton of crazy dragons that give you way more reach that Approach can find for you. Cards like Niv-Mizzet, Visionary, and Nullspine Dragon allow you to draw a ton of cards thanks to Approach dealing so much damage to your opponent. Of course, all of this only really works in Commander. This setup is too slow otherwise. And even if you could do some crazy stuff in the late game by cheating out some dragons, it's usually too little and too late at that point. This spot could have gone to similar cards like Shadowborn Apostle or Persistent Petitioners, but Approach is probably ever so slightly better than these cards are. Approach is mostly a gimmick card, but it's a very popular gimmick in Commander, and one of the more successful gimmicks from this line of cards in the format. And at number 9, we have Say Its Name. This is a sorcery for 1 and 1 green. It has the effect where you mill 3 cards, then return a creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand. You can also exile 3 copies of Say Its Name from your graveyard. And if you do, search your hand, graveyard, and or library for a card named Altanach Thrice Called, and put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. And you can only do this at sorcery speed. For reference, this is a 9/9 with trample and abilities where, when your opponent targets it, you draw a card. And you can pay 1 and 1 green and discard it to return target land card from graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Say Its Name is, even without considering its activated ability, a pretty medium card. Putting more cards into your graveyard is great for a ton of strategies, and milling more copies of Say Its Name itself can lead to stealing games out of nowhere. Altanach is a terrible thing to be staring down on turns 2 through 4, and even if they do have removal for it, you still get to draw a card as a consolation prize. Of course, the thing that makes Say Its Name good is its rather low opportunity cost. With a lot of these other cards which care about itself, you're sometimes just playing bad cards if you can't find enough copies of them. But Say Its Name does several things that certain decks like Greasefang combo really want. This deck wants to get Parhelion 2 into the graveyard and Greasefang onto the field to pull off its combo. 2 things that Say Its Name can help with. This makes Say Its Name a great consistency booster that can also work as its own threat. This has led certain builds of the deck to experiment with the card in Pioneer, though it's not exactly common. It's very possible that this tech will become more popular in the future, though most versions of the deck seem to have decided that cards like Cash Grab are a better fit than Say Its Name as a package. And at number 8, we have Demigod of Revenge. This is a 5/4 spirit avatar with a mana cost of 5 hybrid red-black mana. It has flying and haste, meaning it can only be blocked by flying creatures and creatures with reach, and it can attack right away. When you cast Demigod, you return all Demigods of Revenge from your graveyard to the field. It is worth bringing up that Demigod was released all the way back in Shadowmoor, and the game was a lot weaker back then. The point being that a 5/4 with flight and haste was, at the time, actually pretty good on its own. You could pretty easily play this on turn 5 and just attack with it and be happy with that. However, if you do draw a second demigod after your opponent kills the first one, it's kind of lights out. Getting 2 5-power flyers with haste is a game-winning effect on most board states. This only gets more absurd the more copies of demigod you draw, not to mention if you manage to mill or discard extra copies over the course of the game. However, this approach to using the card wasn't all that common. The card was mostly played in Standard and the now defunct Extended format, where it was mainly used as an aggro curve topper that was just completely insane in multiples. It was also a card that was famously easy to get rule sharked on. You see, if you countered a demigod before the trigger resolved, the trigger would put the demigod you just countered directly onto the battlefield due to the effect to revive itself happening on cast and not on enters. This was such a common bad beat story that it pretty much made Wizards decide to never print another card that worked this way ever again, which was probably the smart move in the long run. And at number 7, we have Galvanic Bombardment. This is an instant with the mana cost of 1 red. It has the effect where it deals X damage to target creature, where X is 2 plus however many copies of Bombardment are already in your graveyard. Essentially, this was a red removal spell that got better and better the more times you cast it, and that may not sound like anything all that exciting. However, especially at the time the card was released, it was quite the strong removal option. There were a lot of creatures that 2 damage would be able to kill running around, from Servant of the Conduit to Grim Flayer. This meant that in the first few turns of the game, against a lot of decks, you have a prime target to bombard. From then on, Bombardment was a pretty above-rate removal spell. Lightning Bolt was considered far too good for the format at this point in Standard's history, and 1 mana for 3 damage to even creatures wouldn't be considered normal for many years. The second Bombardment was already a pretty strong removal spell, and the final 2 may as well have just said destroy target creature a lot of the time. There was very little running around the format that could survive 4 or 5 damage, making Bombardment one of Red's most consistent removal spells during that run through Standard. The only time Bombardment didn't work out was if you only drew your first copy very late into the game, and even then, that was only if your opponent happened to have a high toughness threat in play at that very moment. Most of the time, Bombardment got the job done, especially against decks that relied on lots of medium-sized creatures as opposed to a few larger ones. It is worth comparing it to other similar cards such as Flame Burst, which did the same thing but cost 1 more mana and could target players. You'd think this would make them far more valuable, but that 1 extra mana ended up being a huge deal. 2 mana for 2 damage is just much worse than 1 mana for 2 damage, as it means your removal spells can't be used to answer things like mana dorks with anywhere near the same degree of consistency. While being able to burn your opponent for the last few points of damage is a huge upside, the lack of consistency made the more limited but efficient Bombardment the much more powerful card in actuality. And at number 6, we have Aether Burst. This is an instant for 1 and 1 blue. It has the effect where you return up to X target creatures to their owner's hand, where X is 1 plus however many bursts are in your graveyard. This card is very similar to Galvanic Bombardment, and it's a style of card we'll see a few more times on this list coming up. Instead of being a take on Shock, Aether Burst is a rework on Summon. While it's always card disadvantage, bouncing 2 of your opponent's creatures can be such a setback, it can feel virtually impossible to come back from. A single Aether Burst can effectively set you back several turns at once in terms of tempo, removing multiple turns worth of creatures from the board in one fell swoop. The way most of the decks that use bursts made use of this was putting a lot of pressure on their opponent. Blue-Green Madness played a lot of creatures like Arrogant Worm, which I'm told was actually pretty imposing at the time, and leveraged Aether Burst to allow their creatures to get in for damage. Even though they were going down in cards, it often didn't matter if you were taking 8 damage on that turn. The main thing that holds bursts back is the first one is never really all that strong. Unsummon effects just aren't all that great, and paying 2 mana for one is really hard to justify. It's a card you really need to start scaling before it becomes worth it, a trap that some of the better cards in this list are able to avoid falling into. Still, despite that shortcoming, the power of the second Aether Burst you cast in a game is often enough to get over this hiccup. And at number 5, we have Rune Snag. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It is the effect where you counter target spell unless its controller pays 2 plus another 2 for each snag in your graveyard. This is a pretty common effect for blue. with the most famous version of this effect being Mana Leak, which for the same cost requires your opponent to pay 3 mana or the spell will get countered. Similar to most of these cards, Rune Snag was designed to be a bit worse than what you could get for the cost the first time you cast it, but scaled to be way better than the original version as you cast more copies. However, Rune Snag's balancing is slightly off for a couple of reasons. For one, Mana Leak is nowadays considered a bit too pushed for standard, with versions like Quench only asking your opponent to pay 2 mana. This, of course, makes it identical to what Rune Snag does, meaning that Rune Snag is never actually all that behind the curve. Once it does start scaling, the card becomes extremely valuable. You see, the downside of cards like Quench is that, while they are cheap and powerful interaction early on, the later a game goes, the less powerful they become. Often, they're essentially dead cards once the game goes late enough. However, thanks to Snag scaling, it can stay relevant for a very long time. The final Snag makes your opponent pay a massive 8 mana. So, even if it's the very late game and both players have 10 or more lands, Snag will often still function as a counterspell. All of this made Snag one of the best counterspells of this type in the game. However, the demand for this type of card usually ends in Standard. Formats like Legacy just don't need this type of interaction, and it was generally outclassed in Modern as well. It may make a comeback if it were printed into Standard again and had a chance in Pioneer, but as of right now, the card doesn't really have a place to see play. And at number 4, we have Accumulated Knowledge. This is an instant for 1 and 1 blue. It has the effect where you draw a card, then draw another card for each accumulated knowledge in your graveyard. There are actually a few versions of this card, such as Frantic Inventory and Take Inventory, though the latter is a sorcery rather than an instant. However, Knowledge has been around the longest and has therefore seen the most play. Now, it's worth first comparing Knowledge to other draw spells at around the same mana cost. Chart a Course has the same cost and lets you draw 2 cards, but then you have to discard a card if you haven't attacked this turn. This is also a sorcery, making it less flexible than Knowledge is. As soon as you cast your first copy of Knowledge, all the others are pretty above rate. It also gets around a big issue with most of these cards quite nicely thanks to being a draw spell. The main downside of these kinds of scaling cards is that if you only ever draw the first copy, they're just kinda bad. However, Accumulated Knowledge, being a draw spell, is able to snowball into more copies of itself pretty easily. Each one gives you access to more cards, giving you more chances to draw into additional copies of Knowledge. Combine this with a few cantrips, and you can pretty easily draw your second copy, and start getting a ton of card advantage for cheap. Knowledge has been popular in Pauper after rotating out of Standard, seeing play in random blue decks such as Turbo Frog and Azet Scred, decks that wanted to play a bit of a longer game and could take advantage of the extra draw. While it couldn't quite break into Eternal formats, the fact that Frantic Inventory has seen at least some play in Standard shows that even to this day, this effect is quite powerful. And at number 3, we have Ancestral Anger. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 red. It has the effect where target creature gets +X+0 and gains trample until end of turn, where X is 1 plus the number of angers in your graveyard. Then you draw a card. Now, a good point of comparison for Ancestral Anger may be the card Defiant Strike. This is an instant that simply gives a creature +1/+0 and draws you a card, and would generally be considered quite bad. However, it's seen a surprising amount of competitive play. The reason for this is that there are a ton of creatures such as 10th District Legionnaire that give you beneficial effects when they're targeted. A card that can target one of your own creatures and draw you a card is incredibly powerful with these kinds of creatures, as you get all the benefits and can draw into yet another pump spell to push through even more damage. All of this also applies to Ancestral Anger, except after the first time you cast it, it becomes an incredibly powerful card that pushes through significant damage all on its own. This isn't even bringing up Trample, which can be very annoying to deal with in these scenarios. Your opponent likely won't be able to block the creature you buff profitably. Especially since most of the targets you'll be playing it with get countered when targeted, you'll often be attacking with a creature with 5 or more power on turn 3, far more than the toughness of most creatures at that point in the game. Anger is one of those cards that almost didn't need extra upsides to be playable, but seems to have been given them anyway. And at number 2, we have Squadron Hawk. This is a 1/1 bird for 1 and 1 white. It has flying, and when it enters, you search your library for up to 3 Squadron Hawks, reveal them, put them into your hand, then shuffle. Now, there are a ton of other versions of this card, like Legion Conquistador, but none of them have ever come close to Squawk's level of power. The main reason for this is just how cheap it is to deploy, as it lets you start building that card advantage immediately. The downside is that this card advantage is in the form of pretty awful cards. However, there are a ton of ways to get around this. The main one has been playing a card like Brainstorm alongside Hawk. This is an instant that allows you to draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand back on top of your deck. Hawk will allow you to fill your hand with cards that you can put back with an effect like Brainstorm, and then shuffle away with a fetch land. This was famously done with Jace, the Mind Sculptor, back in Standard, in one of the craziest, least balanced standards the game has ever seen, leading to the Jace's banning in the format. This was at a time when bannings were far more rare in the format as well, so this was quite the dire circumstance. This deck also famously made use of Hawk alongside cards like Sword of Fire and Ice to make sure that they always had an equipped target. While the Hawks weren't threatening on their own, anything wearing a sword was a huge threat, especially when they had flying to help them get in for damage, and that powerful combat damage trigger. All of this combined has allowed Squadron Hawk to maintain use cases in formats like Pauper to this very day. And it's probably why Wizards is far more careful with these kinds of designs nowadays. Still, despite being part of a banned deck, there's one card with this type of design that's still far more powerful than Hawk ever was. And at number 1, we have Rite of Flame. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 red. It has the effect to add 2 red mana, then you add an additional red for each Rite of Flame in each graveyard. From a card that was part of a banned deck to a card that itself has been banned in the modern format, we're really getting to the crazy cards on this list now. To start off with, Rite of Flame is basically just a pyretic ritual that's even easier to use. It gives you 1 extra red mana, but requires less initial investment. While this does mean it's less crazy when combined with cards like Goblin Electromancer, it also still has the higher ceiling between the 2 cards. As the 3rd and 4th rites add so much more mana, you'll be able to cast almost anything you want from your hand, or sometimes from somewhere else, as the decks it's played in often use cards like Past and Flames as an important piece of their combos. We could go over all of the individual combo decks that have played Rite in the past, but it would take too long to talk about them in any sort of meaningful detail. From Storm to Belcher, almost every combo deck that can use red mana has tried to take advantage of Rite at some point. Rite really has everything that makes this style of card work, both scaling extremely well and being good when you draw the first copy. The only cards that can really give it a run for its money are cards like Dark Ritual, which are now considered way too good for the game overall. Rite isn't just one of the best cards that care about other copies of itself, it's just one of the best mana accelerants ever printed.